Let's look, Sandile, first of all, at the perception of political currency and fronting. And we do know that this has not been received favorably by the South African public. And in fact, we have COSATU yesterday launching a civil service movement against corruption, the benefits of those connected to political influence and this. But how damaging has this been to the whole BEE cell, if you like?
Good evening, Kofi, and thanks for having me on your show. I think clearly the issue of fronting and political currency has received a lot of attention in the media of late. And you know, from our sense, it's actually done quite a lot of damage onto the perceptions around BEE, and I think a lot of it stemmed from at the beginning of when BEE came into effect, it was mainly driven by government. So there was a sense that for me to be sure that I'm doing empowerment, I need to get politically connected people onto my company's shareholders to allow me to get access into government contracts. But that was never the intention of the legislation, but I guess it was interpretation in terms of black economic empowerment means having politically connected shareholders.
How widespread is it?
I think of late, I think we've seen quite a lot, especially in the press around fronting, that it seems to be quite a big issue, because we actually asked the question in this year's survey of our participants in terms of saying, you know, if we were to measure BEE fronting, would you want fronting indicators to be measured as part of verification? And if so, would you want it disclosed? And we found that overwhelmingly over 60% of the respondents said, yes, we would like to have fronting indicators measured when it comes to BEE verification. But interestingly, only 50% of those said we should disclose it. So clearly there seems to be some concern around that. And interestingly, when the codes of good practice were initially were in draft form, there was a statement 200 that actually talked about measuring of fronting indicators and disclosure of thereof. But when the codes got gazetted, this sort of disappeared and wasn't included from that side. So there's clearly a gap in our view for the measurement of ownership to evolve to include some fronting indicator measures.
Should we also be pointing fingers here at the companies themselves? In other words, the established companies who have been taking on BEE companies and therefore in part being engaged in this exercise. Should we also be pointing fingers at them and saying, surely the spirit of BEE is that you're trying to get as many black people as possible to become part of the economy, not so much just the politically connected, commercial interests aside?
Yeah. I think it goes both ways. It takes two. So I think the companies, but also there's the sort of BEE investors and partners themselves. But at the end of the day, I think the sort of challenge comes in terms of how are you measuring that ownership? And I think for us, where the gap seems to be is that the legislation basically says any black person qualifies to participate in ownership. Now, had not defining clearly in terms of saying how that black person should be measured and what value should add to the business, it opens up doors, especially to a lot of unscrupulous business people who might consider appointing a politically person, or even worse, they're a domestic worker or gardener, so that I've got a black face on my shareholders. Yeah.
Vikas, feel free to come in here, but just how strong has been the aversion of the established companies to BEE fronting and participation, would you say?
I think the challenge is that I think some of it's not purposely with the intent of actually to front or to only look at politically connected people. It's a lack of saying what it is that's required. So I think a bit more guidance is required from the legislator in terms of saying what we are trying to achieve with ownership empowerment is to allow broader participation by the black people in terms of BEE. Is it in question, though? Sorry?
Is it in question? Because surely that's...
I think the definition says any black person. So if it's any black person, I can choose that person. But I think where the gap is, what the intent was to ensure that you empower a broader base of the people.
Sure.
So they have tried to limit it by saying you can only do deals up to sort of 20 million for you to qualify as a new entrant, but even there you only lose certain points, so you still can do those deals. So you see the same people participating in the same deals over and over.
Yeah. Vikas, you sort of sit on the other side.
Yeah. Well,
to a degree.
My question is really, I mean, you guys are an advisory company.
Correct.
What are you advising your clients to do right now about BEE, and how is that different from what it was maybe 2 or 3 years ago?
I think that's a very good question. I think in the earliest, because we've been doing BEE since 2005 as advising clients, we saw a lot of this sort of what we call political patronage from that perspective. But of late, I think over the last sort of 2 to 3 years, we've seen a definite shift towards the use of what's called broad-based schemes in terms of empowering mainly employees or public offering type schemes. Because I think companies have woken up to the right of saying, you know, for me to really actively drive empowerment, I need to look at empowering a broader base of people versus using the so-called usual suspects. So if you look at the sort of recent deals, the MTN deal, public offering, the Sasol Indala deal, look at public offering. So there's quite a clear shift from the old days, I think companies realized that there isn't much value in having a politically oriented individual. I'd rather empower people who can add value in the community wide in that sense.
I have a question for you, Sandile. Why didn't the companies just look at the first people available, the people who are sitting inside the companies, their own workers, instead of looking outside and saying, who can we find out there when you're sitting with the people right there with you?
I think that's a very good question. I think when BE first came on board, the biggest driver was government. So the sense was, I'm looking to do business with government, so if I need somebody who helps me open up doors and win more contracts, it must be somebody who understands how government works.
So it was contract driven.
Correct. Hence why you saw a lot of people going for previous government employees to empower in the first transactions. Then also when you come to employees, most of the time those people require further assistance from the company and actually in a view to actually buy the shares. Whereas the other investors, like political investors, you can get them to go and leverage off borrowing in the bank themselves versus the company having to go and support the employees from that end. But as I've said, the trend is more and more companies are saying, look, especially with the effect of the recession, because most deals are actually getting funded and supported, the idea has become, if I'm going to fund and support a deal, I'd rather do it with my employees and I'd rather do it maybe with the public offering.
Yeah. Now, in the sectors that you surveyed, how effective has been BEE participation in actually adding value to the businesses?
I think we, comparing, because we did a trend, because we're running the survey for over 5 years now, we've seen that I think this year there's been a slight regression in terms of performance improvement. And a lot of that has been the effects of the recession, because I think over the last 12 to 18 months, most companies have actually found it tough. So a lot of them have focused on cost-cutting measures. And a lot of that tend to inadvertently affect some of the employment equity sort of initiatives. So most companies were not recruiting any further, so they couldn't improve employment equity. Most companies were actually cutting costs, so they reduced their spending to sort of CSI activities as well from that end. So I think a lot of it has been an impact of the recession. But the positive side is that the lack of funding and a facility available has forced companies to move away from the traditional areas of ownership and management control to focus on the internal ones like skills development, because now if I'm looking to retain people, I need to develop people a lot more. And I think, in my view, those are the areas that we should be putting more focus on versus on ownership. If
they had spoken to me, I'd have said pretty much the same thing, because why are you looking outside when you've got the people in there? You develop your people because they are interested in boosting the profit performance of the business. But let's just look at representation inside the companies itself. Quite apart from getting the communities that we've been talking about, there's also, of course, the issue of who is sitting on the board. Are we seeing a greater representation in terms of the black community inside these companies?
I think I'm sure you've seen lots of the reports being released by the Department of Labor and some of the surveys being done at the JSC. We have not seen much of a progress in terms of board representation in terms of black people, even in the management levels, because the Employment Equity Report continues to show that there isn't much progress.
What is the problem?
And I think the challenge is that there has been a traditional focus at looking outside in terms of onboarding black people to participate at board and management level. Now, I think one of the biggest challenges that I think traditionally corporate South Africa needs to do a mind shift in terms of how do we begin to develop our own internal people? Because most of the time when you see recruitment adverts, they say, we need somebody with a qualification and minimum 2 years experience. Where do you find that person? In another company. So companies are not doing what I call growing your own timber. So our view would need a lot more investment in skills development so that you begin to sort of empower and develop your sort of semi-skilled employees to become skilled so that they move up into management, hopefully management and into board. And I think that's probably the answer, but that takes a long time to achieve.
Yeah, but because the law also says you ought to have a certain number of independent directors sitting inside the company. So you do need to look outside at the same time looking from inside. So the competition for representation on that board is that much greater. Disadvantages, of course, the guys who are coming in from outside.
But I think, again, what you want from those independent directors, to a very large degree, is experience. So how many experienced black people are available as non-executive directors? Because
and the skills you're bringing as well.
And the skills you're bringing, because these people are being taken into the executive positions to a very great extent. So there is a portion of skills development and allowing people to get experience that needs to be done. But I think that if we look at sport, for instance, one of the things that is really been a very great disappointment to me is the extent to which sports companies and teams actually invest into the development of youth on the black side. Because if SA Rugby, for instance, had invested into a special rugby school for talented black people 10 years ago, we would have been seeing those people in the Springbok team by now. But shouldn't other industries do the same? Asset management, for instance, why don't they give 100 bursaries.
Correct. And I think that's the answer. I think in the same way we're not seeing that in our sport, even in our corporate South Africa, there's not much investment in the development and recruitment of graduates, because I think more and more companies need to invest in recruiting graduates and investing in development, actually growing those people.
Sandile, quickly, the final picture that we're getting out of BEE and transformation, has it worked, has it not worked, what degree has it?
There's pockets of success in it working, and there's areas where we definitely need to put more emphasis. And in our view, that's where we think the measurement of BE needs to evolve, especially on the ownership side.
Would you mark it out of 100 and give it a score?
Well, I would probably give it just above a 50%.
Just above 50?
We're just passing.